Return to Haifa. Ghassan Kanafani. 1. When said S arrived at the entrance to the city, driving along the road to Jerusalem, he felt something that stopped his tongue, inducing him to silence, and dissolved into a sadness that took over his body. For a moment, he thought about going back. Without looking at her, he knew that she was crying silently, while listening to the sound of the sea just like in the past. No, the memory didn't come to him little by little, it fell like an avalanche into his head, a world of stones that collapsed and buried him. The incidents and events came suddenly and crashed down on him, oppressing his entire body. He thought to himself that Safiya, his wife, felt exactly the same, and that's why she was crying. Since he left Ramallah that morning he hadn't stopped talking, nor had she. The fields crossed the windshield and the unbearable heat burned his forehead, like the asphalt boiling under the car tires. Above him, the scorching June sun spread its fury. During the long journey, he talked and talked. He talked to his wife about everything: the war and defeat, the Mandelbaum Gate, which tanks tore down, the enemy who reached the river bank and the Suez Canal and the entrance to Damascus, the ceasefire, the radio and the looting of things and objects by the army, and the curfew, and the cousin who is in Kuwait with his worries, and the neighbor who collected his things and fled, and the 3 Arab soldiers who fought alone for 2 days on the hill near the Augusta Victoria Hospital, and the men who took off their uniforms and fought in the streets of Jerusalem, and the peasant who was killed when they saw him near one of Ramallah's largest hotels. His wife went on and on about many other things during the journey. And now, when they arrived at the entrance to Haifa, they fell silent at the same time and realized, at that moment, that they had not said a single word about the subject that had brought them there. There was Haifa, 20 years later. On the afternoon of June 30, 1967, the car, a grey Fiat with white Jordanian plates, was traveling north, crossing the plain whose name, for 20 years, had been Marj Ben Amer. It traveled along the coastal region, towards the southern entrance to Haifa, then he crossed the road and took the main road. He felt like all the walls came down and the street dissolved in a flood of tears. "This is Haifa, Safiya," he heard himself say to his wife. He felt the steering wheel heavy between his hands, sweaty as ever. "It's Haifa, I know her, but she ignores me," it occurred to her to say, but she changed her mind. After a moment, struck by a thought, he said, "You know, for 20 long years, I always thought that the Mandelbaum Gate would be opened one day. But I never imagined that it would be opened from the other side. It didn't cross my mind, so, when they opened it, the situation seemed scary, stupid and, in a way, humiliating. I may sound crazy for saying that all doors must open from one side only and that if they are opened from the other side, we have to consider them as if they were closed, but that's the truth." He turned to Safiya, who stood oblivious, her gaze fixed on the road, now to the right, where the cultivated land stretched as far as could be seen, now to the left, where the sea, distant for more than 20 years, it sounded close. "I never imagined I'd see you again," she said suddenly. "You don't see it, they show it to you," said replied. At that moment, for the first time, she lost control and screamed. "What are these ramblings you've been saying all day? The gates, the views, and everything else. What happened to you?" "What happened to me?" he said to himself, shaking, but he controlled his nerves and said again, calmly. "They opened the borders suddenly, as soon as they concluded the occupation, and this did not happen in any other war in history. You know the scary things that happened in April 1948. Why now? Because of my beautiful eyes or yours? No. It's part of the war. They tell us, come in and see how better and more evolved we are. You have to accept serving us and admiring us, but you can see for yourself, nothing has changed. We could have done something much better for her. Then why did you come?" He gave her a stern look, and she fell silent. If she knew, why did she ask? And it was she who insisted that they come. For 20 long years, she avoided talking about the subject. 20 years. Then the past erupted like an erupting volcano. As she drove through the streets of Haifa, the smell of war was still strong enough to make the city seem dark and exciting and provocative, with its hard, savage faces. After a while, she realized that she was driving through the streets of Haifa with the feeling that nothing had changed. He knew it, stone by stone, intersection by intersection, as he had driven its green 1946 Ford countless times. He knew her very well, driving now, after 20 years, as she used to do. She felt as if she hadn't been absent for all those bitter years. And the names shook off the dust and came back to him: Wadi Anisnaz, Malik Faisal Street, Hanatir Square, Halisa, Hadar. The names jumbled together in his mind, but he remained sober and asked his wife in a low voice, "Where do we start?" Safiya remained silent. He heard her cry almost silently, and shared that feeling, even without being able to appreciate the extent of her suffering, which had lasted for 20 years and which now stood like a giant in his gut, in his head, in his heart, in his memories and imagination, and controlled his entire future. He marveled at the fact that he had never thought about what this suffering could mean for her and how it seeped into her wrinkles, her eyes, and her mind. He was with her in every portion of what she ate, in every tent she lived in every look she gave her children, him and herself. Now, everything rose from the wreckage of oblivion and pain, bearing the weight of the bitter defeat he had tasted at least twice in his life. Suddenly the past came crashing down on him, sharp as a knife. He was turning the car at the end of Malik Faisal Street, towards the intersection that goes down to the port, straight onto the road that leads to Wadi Anisnaz, when he saw a group of armed soldiers, standing at the intersection, in front of an armored blockade. As he watched them out of the corner of his eye, he heard a noise like an explosion in the distance. And he heard a hail of gunfire that made the steering wheel shake in his hands. He almost hit the sidewalk, but at the last moment he recovered. He saw a boy running down the street. That scene transported him to the terrible and tumultuous past. For the first time in 20 years, he remembered what had happened, in great detail, as if he were reliving it all. Morning, Wednesday, April 21, 1948. Haifa did not expect the events, despite being filled with tension and fury. The bombardment came abruptly from the east, from the top of Mount Carmel. The lights of the mortars crossed the city center towards the Arab neighborhoods. The streets of Haifa were transformed into chaos, where fear reigned, forcing the closure of shops and workshops and house windows throughout the region. Said S was in the heart of the city when the sound of gunfire and explosions filled the Haifa sky until early afternoon. He did not imagine that the attack would be so comprehensive, and he tried, scared, for the first time, to return home, when he discovered that it would be impossible. He walked through the side streets with the intention of getting to Halisa, where he lived, but confusion spread. He saw armed men running from the adjacent street to the main street and vice versa. They moved guided by instructions that came from speakers placed in strategic locations. After a while, Said became even more confused. The alleys, closed by weapons or the soldiers themselves, seemed to lead him in a single direction. More than once, as he tried to return to the main path by choosing a particular alley, he was pushed by an invisible force towards one destination, the coastal path. He had been married to Safiya for a year and 4 months and had rented a small house in that area, as he thought it would be safer. Now, he suddenly felt that he wouldn't reach her, and he knew that his wife wouldn't be able to take care of herself. Since he had brought her from the village, she had not gotten used to life in the city or the complexity of unsolvable circumstances, which terrified her. What would happen to her? He was more or less lost and had no idea where the fight was taking place or how. As far as he knew, or as far as he could know, the English still controlled the city, and the outcome of the events was scheduled to occur after 3 weeks, when the British would begin to withdraw according to the scheduled date. He quickened his pace, aware that he must avoid the high places connected by Herald Street, where the Jews had settled since the beginning. On the other hand, he should distance himself from the shopping center that was between the Haifa neighborhood and Allenby Street, because that was the place where their weapons were heavily concentrated. Then, he circled the mall to get to Haifa. He was facing the street that ended in Wadi Anisnaz and passed through the old city. Suddenly things got mixed up and names crossed: Haifa, Wadi Ruchmaya, Al-Burjay, the old city, Wadi Anisnaz. He felt completely bewildered and lost his way. The bombardment increased. Even though he was far from the scene of the shooting, he was able to distinguish the English soldiers closing some passages and opening others. Then he realized that he was in the old town and ran, with a vitality he had not imagined he had, towards the south of Stanton Street, for he knew that it was less than 200 meters from Halil Street. He smelled the sea. Immediately, he remembered little Khaldun, his son, who turned 5 months old that same day, and a darkness took over him. He felt a taste on his tongue that he never stopped feeling and that he still feels to this day, 20 years later. Could he wait for this disaster? Events blended together, past and present together, and became confused with the thoughts, illusions, imaginations, and feelings of the next 20 years. He knew. Did he feel the fatality before it occurred? Sometimes he would say to himself, "Yes, I knew it before it happened." Other times, he thought, "No, I only realized it later. I couldn't expect anything as horrible as that." Night settled over the city. He had no idea how many hours had passed since he started running through the streets one by one. It was evident that it was being pushed towards the port, as all adjacent streets leading to the main road were closed. He kept diving into these streets, trying to get home, but he was always driven back, sometimes by rifle barrels, sometimes by bayonets. The sky was on fire, crackling with gunfire, bombs, and explosions, near and far. It was as if the same sounds were pushing everyone towards the port. Even though he couldn't focus on anything specific, he couldn't help but see how the crowd grew with each step. People came out of the alleys onto the main street, leading to the port, men, women, and children, empty-handed or carrying a few small possessions, cried or swam in that astonishment in dead silence. He plunged into the waves of the crowd and lost control of his steps. He still remembered that he was heading towards the sea, led by the crowd that was crying in amazement, unable to think of anything. In his mind there was a single image, like a photo hanging on the wall, his wife Safiya and his son Khaldun. The hard moments passed slowly and seemed like a terrible, unbelievable nightmare. He passed through the port's iron gate, where British soldiers were corralling the crowd, and from there he could see people falling onto the small boats anchored at the pier. Not knowing exactly what he should do, he decided not to go forward to the boats. And like someone who suddenly goes mad, or someone whose senses return all at once after a long period of insanity, he turned and pushed the people with every ounce of strength he could muster, forging a path through the horde, toward opposite, back to the iron gate. As if crossing a waterfall coming from a very high mountain, Said opened the way with his shoulders, arms, legs and head. The current dragged him back and he moved forward ferociously again, looking like a hunted animal opening an impossible path through a tangled virgin forest. Above his head, there was smoke, the boom of bombs and bursts of gunfire, which mixed with the screams, the sound of the sea, the lost footsteps of the crowd and the noise of oars hitting the surface of the water. Has it really been 20 years? Cold sweat ran down his forehead. He was driving the car down the hill. He hadn't counted on the memories returning, filled with the same insane turmoil that rightfully belonged to the real moments of his own experience. He glanced at his wife out of the corner of his eye. Her face was rigid, pale, and her eyes were full of tears. Surely she must be returning in her own footsteps to that very day when he was close to the sea and she was as close as possible to the mountain, while between them stretched the invisible threads of fear and confusion, over a fearful and unknown swamp. He was, as she had told him more than once in the previous years, thinking about him. When the shooting started, and people came with news that the British and Jews had begun to take Haifa, Safiya felt terrible fear. She was thinking about him when she heard the sound of battle coming from the city center. She knew it was coming from there. She felt safer. She remained at home for a while, but when she realized he was taking a while, she ran out into the street, not knowing exactly what she was looking for. Before, she looked through the window and out onto the balcony. She felt that things changed completely when the fire came roaring down in the early afternoon from the hills above Haifa. She felt besieged and only then went down the steps. Along the way, towards the main street, the urgency and desire to see him gave the measure of how much she feared for him. Her concern about her uncertain fate led her to 1,000 possibilities with each shot fired. When she reached the beginning of the street, she passed between the rushing vehicles, and her steps took her between cars and people. She asked without getting answers. Suddenly, she found herself in the middle of the crowd, being pushed to all corners of the city by the uncontrollable current, like a branch carried by a violent river. How long was it before she remembered that the baby, Khaldun, was still in his crib at Haifa? She didn't know for sure, but she realized that an imperious force was pinning her to the ground, where the endless crowd of people passed and touched her shoulders, like a tree firmly rooted in a strong flood. So, she tried to resist that current with all her strength and, faced with weakness and exhaustion, she screamed with all the power her throat possessed. Her words traveled over the crowd, but reached no one's ears. She repeated Khaldun 1,000, 1,000,000 times. Months later, she still carried a hoarse, battered, and inaudible voice in her mouth, and the word Khaldun remained like a dot floating in nothingness, lost in the middle of an endless avalanche of voices and names. She was almost falling under people's feet when she heard a voice, which ripped her from the earth, call her name. Seeing his face covered in sweat, anger, and fatigue, she felt the size of the misfortune. Sadness hit his chest like a strong, never-ending knife. She decided to return at any cost. She thought that she might never be able to look Said in the eyes again nor let him touch her again. Inwardly, she realized that she was losing both of them at the same time, Said and Khaldun. She continued to make her way with the strength she had in her arms, in the middle of a forest that closed the space around her. At the same time, she tried to lose herself from Said, who had made the decision, without realizing it and without reflecting, to call, alternately, Safiya and Khaldun. Had it been generations and eons before she felt strong, steady hands pulling her by the shoulders. She looked into his eyes and was struck by a kind of paralysis, which made her fall onto his shoulder like a worthless rag. Around them, a current of people pushed them from one side to the other towards the sea, but they no longer had any strength or felt anything. Only when they saw the foam of the water floating beneath the oars did they look towards the beach, where the city of Haifa disappeared blurred behind the afternoon and the tears. 2. On the way from Ramallah to Haifa, passing through Jerusalem, he talked about everything, without stopping for a moment. When he arrived at the entrance to Bet Galim, he was overcome by silence. Here's Haifa, he thought as he heard the sound of the car's wheels. His restless heart made him lose his way from time to time. 20 years of absence were reduced and, suddenly, in an incredible way, things returned to where they were, as if contrary to reason and logic. What was he looking for? A week earlier, at his home in Ramallah, Safiya had told him. They're going everywhere now. Why don't we go to Haifa? Said was eating dinner at that moment and saw his hand stop involuntarily between the plate and his mouth. He looked at his wife after a moment and saw her move away so he couldn't read anything in her eyes. Then he said to her, "Go to Haifa?" "For what?" "To see our house." "Just that," she replied in a low voice. He put the portion of food back on the plate, got up and stood in front of her. Safiya kept her head bowed against her chest, like someone confessing an unexpected sin. He lifted his head to look into her eyes, which were moist. "Safiya, What do you want from this? He asked compassionately. So he nodded and agreed without speaking, for he knew what she thought. Maybe Said thought about it all the time too, but she expected him to bring it up, that way she wouldn't feel as always guilty for the catastrophe that took over both their hearts. Khaldun? Said whispered hoarsely. Suddenly, that name, which had remained unspoken for so long, was out in an open space. The few times they referred to the child, they always said him. They avoided giving any of their other children that name, although they called the eldest Khalid and their daughter, who was born a year and a half later, Khalida. Said, called Abu Khalid, and his old friends, who had knowledge of what had occurred, agreed in saying that Khaldun had died. How could the past rush in through the back door in such an extraordinary way now? Said remained still, as if he were sleeping somewhere far away. After a while, he caught his breath and returned to his place. Before sitting down, she said. Illusion, Safiya, illusion. Don't be fooled by this sad image. You know how we search and investigate. You know the stories of the Red Cross, the peacekeeping forces and the foreign friends we sent there. No, I don't want to go to Haifa. It's humiliating. If it is already a humiliation for the people of Haifa, for you and for me, it is a double humiliation. Why torture us? The sobs sounded louder, but she remained silent. They spent the night without saying a word, listening to the sound of soldiers' boots in the streets and the commands issued over the radio. When she went to sleep, she knew in her heart that there was no way she could escape this. The thought that had been lurking in him for 20 years finally came to light, and it was impossible to bury it again. Even though he knew that his wife wasn't sleeping and was thinking the same thing, he didn't say anything to her. Early in the morning, she calmly addressed him. If you want to go, take me with you. Said, don't try to go alone. He knew Safiya well and was aware that she knew exactly what was going through his mind. Once again, she caught his thought halfway. During the night, he had decided to go alone. She discovered her decision instinctively. They remained suspended over their thoughts, day and night, for a week. They chewed them with their food and slept with them, but they didn't say a word about it. Then, just a day earlier, Said told his wife. Let's go to Haifa tomorrow, at least to look. Maybe we can pass by our house. I think they will issue an order banning travel soon as their calculations were wrong. He was quiet for a moment and wasn't sure if he wanted to change the subject, but he allowed himself to continue. In Jerusalem, Nablus, and here, people talk every day about their visits to Jaffa, Akka, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Safed, and the villages of Galilee and Muthalat. They tell the same story. It seems that what they saw with their own eyes is worse than they imagined. Everyone comes back very disappointed. The miracle the Jews spoke of was nothing more than an illusion. There is a strong negative reaction in the country, exactly the opposite of what they intended when they opened the border to us. So, Safiya, I assume they will cancel the order soon. So I thought to myself, why don't we take the opportunity and go? When he looked at Safiya, she was trembling. She saw his face pale before fleeing the room. He felt bitter tears block her throat. Since then, Khaldun's name has not stopped buzzing in his head, just as it had 20 years ago, over and over again and above the growing crowd at the port. Surely the same thing was going on in Safiya's mind, as they talked about everything throughout the trip, everything except Khaldun. Finally, near Bet Galim, they fell silent. Here they were, looking in silence at the streets they knew so well, glued to their heads like flesh and blood. As she used to do 20 years ago, she slowed the car before reaching that curve, which hid the rough rocky surface behind her. He turned the car as usual and drove up the slope, observing the place carefully from the narrow road. The 3 cypress trees that hung over the road had new branches. He wanted to take a moment to read the names long ago carved into the trunks, for he could almost remember them one by one, but he didn't. However, a memory came to mind when he saw a member of the Cowrie family crossing a gate that he knew well. This family owned a building south of Stanton, near Al-Muluk Street. It was in this building on the day of the escape that the Arab fighters set up a barricade and fought until the last bullet and perhaps even the last man. As he passed the building, he was pushed into the harbor by a force greater than himself. He remembered exactly that he had been there, and that only there did the memory fall upon him, hitting him like a stone. It was there, in that very place, that he had remembered Khaldun, and his heart sank the same way it had 20 years ago, beating so loudly you could almost hear it. Suddenly the house came into view, the same house in which he had lived and which had lived in his memory all that time. Here it was, with its balconies painted yellow. At that moment he imagined Safiya young again, with her long braids, leaning over the porch, looking at him. There was a new clothesline, stretched between two beams, with new clothes, red and white, hanging. Safiya cried so that she could be heard. He turned the car to the right and drove the wheels up onto the low sidewalk, parking it in its old spot, as he had done exactly 20 years ago. Said S hesitated for a moment, letting the engine stall. He knew that if he stood there for too long, he would start the engine again and return. He made it seem, to him and her, that everything was perfectly natural, as if the last 20 years had been put into a press and crushed into a thin sheet of transparent paper. Then, he got out of the car and slammed the door behind him. He adjusted his pants belt, looked out at the porch, and casually dangled the keys in his palm. Safiya came closer and stood next to her, but she wasn't as composed as her husband. He took her arm and they crossed the street, the sidewalk, the green iron gate, to the steps. And they began to rise. He didn't give them the chance to see the little things that he knew very well would move him and make him lose his balance: the doorbell, the copper doorknob, the children's scribbles, the light box, the broken fourth step on the stairs. Center, the curved and smooth balustrade, the iron grill of the window, the first floor where Majuba Saadi lived, whose door was always ajar, with children playing in front, filling that staircase with their screams. They arrived at a closed and recently painted wooden door. He rang the doorbell and commented in a low voice to Safiya. They changed the doorbell. He was silent for a moment and then added, "And the name, of course." He forced a foolish smile, shook Safiya's hand, which seemed cold and trembling, while behind the door slow footsteps sounded, and said to himself, "An elderly person, without a doubt." With the muffled sound of the lock, the door slowly opened. "So she is she," he said. He didn't know whether out loud or to himself with a deep sigh. He remained standing in the same place without having any idea what he should say. He blamed himself for not having prepared an opening sentence, even though he had imagined this moment would come. He moved and looked at Safiya for help. Khalid stepped forward and said, "We come?" The lady didn't understand. She was a little fat, short and wore a blue dress with white polka dots. When Said translated it into English, the lines on the woman's forehead rose in surprise. She moved out of the way for them to enter, then led them into the living room. He followed her, with slow, hesitant steps, with Safiya at her side. They began to observe things around them with some perplexity. The entrance seemed smaller and damper than he imagined. He saw many things that he once considered, and still considered, intimate and personal, believing them to be sacred and private in character, which no one could know, touch or see. The image of Jerusalem, which he remembered so vividly, still hung in the same place. On the opposite wall, a small Syrian rug remained where it had always been. He looked around and rediscovered the items, now little by little, now all at once, like someone who has recovered from a long period of unconsciousness. When they reached the room, he saw 2 chairs from the set of 5 they had. The other 3 were new, but seemed rougher and out of harmony with the rest of the furniture. In the center of the room was the same table, studded with shells, although its color had faded. The glass vase on the table had been replaced by a wooden one, still with a bunch of peacock feathers, which used to contain 7 of them. He tried to count them from where he was sitting, but he couldn't. He then got up, went towards the vase and counted them. There were only 5. When he turned to return to his seat, he saw that the curtains had been changed. The ones that Safiya had made 20 years before, in beige crochet, disappeared and were replaced by curtains with long blue stripes. Then, her gaze fell on Safiya, who, confused, examined the corners of the room with her own eyes, as if enumerating the things that were missing. The fat, elderly woman, sitting across from them on the arm of one of the chairs, looked at them with an expressionless smile on her face. Finally, without changing that cold expression, she said, "I've been waiting for you for a long time." His English was halting and marked by an accent close to German. She seemed to pull out the words as if she were pulling them out of a bottomless pit as soon as she spoke them. Said leaned forward and asked her, "Do you know who we are?" The woman nodded her head several times to emphasize her certainty. She thought for a moment, choosing her words, and then said slowly, "You are the owners of this house, I know that." "As you know?" The question was asked by Said and Safiya at the same time. The lady's smile widened. She answered, "For everything. From the photographs, from the way the two of you stood in front of the door. The truth is that, since the war ended, many people came, looked at the houses and entered them. Every day I said that you would definitely come." Suddenly, she seemed confused and started looking at the things around her, spread out in the room, as if she were seeing them for the first time. Involuntarily, Said followed her gaze, moving it to where hers moved, and Safiya did the same thing. Said to himself, "How strange. 3 pairs of eyes looking at the same thing. But how different each one sees it." He heard the woman's voice, now lower and even slower. "Sorry, but that's how things happened. I had never thought about it until now." Said smiled bitterly. He didn't know how he could tell her that he hadn't come for that reason, that he would not enter into a political discussion, that he knew she wasn't guilty of anything. Without any fault. No, not exactly. But how could he explain this to her? Safiya spared him the trouble and questioned her in a voice that sounded innocently suspicious, while he translated. "Where are you from?" "From Poland." "When?" "In 1948. "When exactly?" "Early March 1948. A strong silence took over the place, and everyone looked at things they had no reason to look at. Said broke the silence, saying calmly, "Naturally, we didn't come to tell you to get out of here. That would need a war." Safiya squeezed his hand to prevent him from continuing the conversation, and he understood. He tried to keep his words closer to the topic. "I mean, your presence here, in this house, our house, mine, and Safiya's, is another matter. We just came to look at things, these things are ours. Maybe you can understand this." She said quickly. "I understand, but..." Then he lost his composure. "Yes, but..." "This but is terrible, deadly, bloody." He fell silent under the pressure of his wife's gaze. He felt that he would never be able to achieve his goal. They were about to collide, and what would follow now would be nothing more than an absurd conversation. For a moment, he thought about getting up and leaving, as nothing else mattered to him. Whether Khaldun was alive or dead no longer mattered. When things get to this point, there is simply nothing to say. He was filled with a helpless and bitter anger, and he felt as if he was about to explode from the inside. His gaze fell, without knowing why, on the 5 peacock feathers deposited in the wooden vase in the middle of the room. He saw its bright, rare colors shift in the breeze from the open window. Suddenly he asked sharply, indicating the vase. "There were 7 feathers, what happened to the other 2? The lady looked where he was pointing and looked back at him in surprise, while said continued to indicate the vase with his arm, with his gaze fixed, waiting for the answer. The entire universe was supported by the balance present at the tip of his tongue. She got up from the chair, held the vase as if for the first time and, slowly, said, "I don't know where the two feathers you're talking about are. I can't remember. Maybe Dov played with them and lost them when he was a kid." "Dov?" They said this together, said and Safiya, and stood up as if the earth had thrown them into the air. They looked at her tensely, and she continued, "Yes, Dov. I have no idea what his name was, but you know what, he looks like you." 3. Now, after 2 hours of intermittent conversation, it was possible to put things in order, to understand what had happened in those few days between the night of Wednesday, April 21, 1948, when said S left Haifa on a British boat with his wife, to be dumped an hour later on the Silver Coast of Akka, and Thursday, April 29, 1948, when a member of the Haganah, accompanied by an elderly man who looked like a chicken, opened the door to said's house S in Haifa, and cleared the way for Efrat Koshin and his wife, both from Poland, to enter what from then on became their home, rented from the Department of Custody of Absent Persons Properties in Haifa. Efrat Koshin arrived in Haifa from an Italian port with his wife at the beginning of March under the auspices of the Jewish Agency. He had left Warsaw with a small convoy of people at the beginning of November 1947. He lived in a temporary residence, on the outskirts of the Italian port, which at the time was unusually busy. In early March 1948, they were taken by ship with some of the other men and women to Haifa. His documents were in perfect order. A small truck took him and his few possessions through the noisy port area filled with British soldiers, Arab workers, and goods, through the tense streets of Haifa, where the sounds of sporadic gunfire could be heard. In Hadar, he was housed in a small room in a building full of people. Efrat Koshin soon realized that most of those rooms were occupied by recent immigrants, awaiting eventual transfer somewhere else. He didn't know if the residents used the name immigrant housing as a novelty when they sat down together for dinner every night, or if that name had existed before and they simply made use of it. Maybe he saw Haifa from his balcony a few times, but he didn't know, nor could he imagine, that he would live there. In fact, he believed that when things calmed down, he would be moved to a quiet house in a rural area at the foot of a hill in Galilee. He had read Thieves in the Dark by Arthur Koestler while he was in Italy. It had been borrowed by a man who had come from England to supervise the migration operation and had lived for a time in those hills of Galilee, which Koestler used as the backdrop for his novel. In fact, not much was known about Palestine at that time. For Efrat, Palestine was no more than a stage adapted from an ancient legend, still decorated in the manner of the colorful scenes depicted in Christian religious books, intended to be read by children in Europe. Of course, he didn't fully believe that the place was just a desert rediscovered by the Jewish Agency after 2,000 years, even though that wasn't what mattered most to him. He had been installed in that accommodation where waiting had become a daily routine for him and the others who were there. Perhaps because he had heard gunshots ever since he left Haifa harbor at the end of that first week in March 1948, it did not occur to him that something terrible was happening at that moment. In any case, he had never met an Arab in his entire life. In fact, it was in Haifa that he met the first Arab, a year and a half after the occupation. This situation caused him, during these difficult times, to keep a unique and ambiguous image of what was really happening. It was a mythical image, in perfect harmony with what he had imagined in Warsaw, and later in Italy, during 25 years of his life. Until then, all those battles he had heard about or read about in the Palestine Post every morning were nothing more than battles between men and ghosts. Where exactly was he on Wednesday, April 21, 1948, at the time when said S was lost between Allenby Street and Harrod Halil, and his wife, Safiya, was taken from Haifa to the edge of the shopping center towards Stanton Street? At this point, it was impossible to recall the events with precision and detail. However, he remembered the attack that began on Wednesday morning and lasted, without interruption, until Thursday night. Only on the morning of Friday, April 23, was he able to say with certainty that everything was over in Haifa, and that the Haganah was in complete control of the situation. He didn't know exactly what had happened. The explosion seemed to come from Hadar, but the description of the events on the radio combined with the stories reported by people who arrived little by little mixed together, making things very difficult to understand. He learned that the attack, which began on Wednesday morning, was launched from 3 points, and that Colonel Moshe Carmel commanded 3 battalions in Hadar HaCarmel and the commercial center. One of the battalions had the mission to take Halisa, the bridge, and Wadi Rachmaya, in the port region. At the same time, another battalion advanced from the commercial center to trap the people who were fleeing, forcing them to head towards a narrow passage that led to the sea route. Efrat didn't know those places, whose names he memorized after repeating them so much. But there was a connection between the words Irgun and Wadi Eniznaz, which made him understand that that gang was in charge of the attack on that place. Efrat Kosher did not need anyone to tell him that the British were interested in handing Haifa over to the Haganah. He knew they made joint rounds and was able to see it for himself 2 or 3 times. He did not remember how he received the information about Brigadier Stockwell's role, but he was certain it was true. The rumor that the brigadier directed all his support to the Haganah circulated throughout the 4 corners of the immigrant accommodation. In fact, Stockwell concealed the date of the withdrawal of British forces and leaked it only to the Haganah, who used the information as an element of surprise, as the Arabs imagined that the British army would relinquish power at a later date. Efrat stayed at the immigrant housing on Wednesday and Thursday, as everyone had been instructed not to leave the place. Some started to leave on Friday, but he stayed until Saturday morning. He was impressed by the fact that he didn't see any cars. It was a true Jewish Sabbath. It brought tears to his eyes, for reasons he couldn't explain. When his wife noticed, she was surprised and said to him with equally moist eyes, "I cry for another reason. Yes, it's a real Saturday. But there is no real Friday or real Sunday here anymore." That was just the beginning. For the first time since her arrival, she drew her husband's attention to something troubling, something he hadn't counted on and that she hadn't thought about. Suddenly, the signs of destruction he began to notice led him to another thought, but he refused to think about it. From the point of view of his wife, Miriam, however, the situation was different. It changed when she passed near the Bethlehem church in Hadar. She saw, from where she was, 2 young men from the Haganah carrying something that they had placed in a small pickup truck. For an instant, she realized what they were carrying, grabbed her husband's arm and, trembling, shouted, "Look!" But Efrat saw nothing when he looked where she was pointing. The 2 men wiped their palms on their khaki shirts. She said to her husband, "It was a dead Arab child. I saw. She was covered in blood." He guided her across the street and asked, "How do you know it was an Arab child? Didn't you see how they threw her into the truck like a piece of wood? If it had been a Jewish child, they would never have done that." He wanted to ask her why, but when he saw her face, he remained silent. Miriam had lost her father in Auschwitz 8 years ago. Before that, when they invaded the place where she lived with her husband, she took refuge with her neighbors upstairs. The German soldiers didn't find anyone, but when they got down, they bumped into her younger brother, who was going to meet her. He was 10 years old and he was going up to inform her that's what he assumed, that her father had been taken to the concentration camp and he was alone. When she noticed the German soldiers, he turned and ran. She watched everything through a narrow gap, a small gap between the steps. From there, she saw them shoot her brother. When Efrat and Miriam returned to the immigrant housing, she decided to return to Italy. But she was unable, neither that night nor in the following days, to convince her husband. She always lost when she argued with him and couldn't find the words to express her points of view or explain the real reason for wanting to leave. A week later, However, the situation changed again. Efrat returned from a visit to the Jewish agency office in Haifa with two pieces of good news. They had received a house in Haifa and, with the house, a 5-month-old baby. On the evening of Thursday, April 22, 1948, Tura Zinstein, the divorced woman who lived with her young son on the third floor, just above said S, heard the sound, coming from the second floor, of a baby crying already without strength. At first, she couldn't believe the thought that came to her mind, but as the moaning continued, she went down to the second floor and knocked on the door. Finally, she felt compelled to break it in. She saw a child in the crib, completely exhausted, and took him to her home. Tura thought things would return to normal soon. It didn't take long, however, just 2 days for that assessment to dissolve. She realized that the situation was completely different from what she imagined. It was not possible for her to keep a baby. So she took him to the Jewish agency office in Haifa, believing that something would be done to resolve the problem. It was fortunate that Efrat Koshin came to this Jewish agency office some time later, as the officials saw from his papers that he had no children. They offered him a house in Haifa as a special concession if he agreed to adopt the child. This proposition came as a pleasant surprise to Efrat, who had longed to adopt a child since he was absolutely sure that Miriam could not have children. It seemed like a gift from God and he could hardly believe it had happened so suddenly. Without a doubt, a child would transform Miriam completely, put an end to that strange thing that had lived in his thoughts ever since he saw the Arab child being thrown into the truck, like a worthless piece of wood. Thursday, April 29, 1948, was the day that Efrat Koshin and his wife Miriam, accompanied by the chicken-faced Jewish agency employee, carried a 5-month-old baby to the home of said S in Halisa. As for Said and Safiya, that same day, they were both crying after he had undertaken the last of his countless attempts to return to Haifa. Tired and without strength, he slept, completely overcome by exhaustion, as if he were unconscious, in that room that was the 6th-year classroom at the Marif Secondary School, in front of the wall that protected the famous Akka prison, on the western bank. Said didn't even try Miriam's coffee. Safiya only took a sip, and took a piece of biscuit from a tin that Miriam offered with a smile. Said continued to look around and his confusion eased as he listened to Miriam's story unfold for what seemed like a long time. He and Safiya remained tied to the chair, waiting for something unknown to happen, something they couldn't imagine. Miriam came and went, and each time she disappeared behind the door, they heard her slow footsteps shuffling across the floor. With her eyes closed, Safiya could imagine Miriam passing through the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen, with the bedroom to her right. Again she heard the door slam. Then, she looked at her husband and said in a bitter tone, "She acts like the house is hers. As if she were in her own home." They smiled silently as Said pressed his palms between his knees, unable to decide what to do. Finally, Miriam returned and Said asked her, "When will he arrive? He should be back by now, but he's late. He was never punctual when it came to coming home, just like his father, who..." She fell silent, biting her lip and looking at Said, who was shaking as if he had received an electric shock. "Like your father?" So he asked himself, what is fatherhood? It was like opening a window and leaving it wide open to an unexpected cyclone. He put his head in his hands to try to stop that crazy turn of the question that had been stored somewhere in her mind for 20 years, without ever having had the courage to face it. Safiya caressed her shoulder, understanding, in a strange way, the sudden impact of those words, which collided to bring about the inevitable. Safiya exclaimed, "Listen to what she's saying. Like your father? As if Khaldun had any other father than you." Then Miriam stepped forward and prepared to say something difficult. Slowly, she extracted the words, as if a hand pulling them from the depths of a dusty pit. "Listen, Mr. Said. I want to tell you something important. I would like you to wait for Dov, or Khaldun, if you prefer, so that they can talk and close the issue, as there is no doubt that it must have an outcome. Do you think this hasn't been a problem for me, as it has been for you? For the last 20 years I have had my doubts, but now it is time to put the matter to rest. I know who his father is, I also know that he is our son, but let's let him decide, let's let him choose. He is already of legal age and we must recognize that he is the only one who has the right to choose. Accordingly, Said got up and walked around the room. He stopped in front of the shell-studded table and once again counted the feathers in the wooden vase. He did not say anything. He remained silent, as if he hadn't heard a word. Miriam watched him anxiously. Finally, he turned to Safiya and explained what Miriam had said. Safiya got up, stood next to her and said in a trembling voice, "That's a fair proposal. I am sure Khaldun will choose his real parents. It is impossible to renounce the call of blood and flesh." Suddenly, Said laughed with all his intensity and his laughter was filled with a deep bitterness that announced defeat. "Which Khaldun, Safiya? Which Khaldun? What flesh and blood are you talking about? You say this is a fair proposal? They taught him how to be for 20 years, day after day, hour after hour in his food, in his drink, in his rest. And you say it's a fair proposition. Only Khaldun, or Dov, or the devil, or whoever you want, doesn't know us? Want to know what I think? Let's get out of here and go back to the past. The matter is closed. They stole it." Said looked at Safiya, who had slumped in her chair. For the first time, she faced the truth in one fell swoop. Her husband's words seemed true, but she still tried to hold onto the invisible thread of hope, which she had built in her imagination 20 years earlier, like a kind of bribe. Then her husband said to her, "Maybe he never knew he was the son of Arabs. Maybe he only knew that a month ago, or a week ago, or a year ago. What do you think? He was deceived, and perhaps he was even more excited by this deception. The crime began 20 years ago and there is no doubt that someone will pay the price. It began the day we left him here. But we didn't let him. You know. Yes, we did. But we shouldn't have left anything. Not Khaldun, not the house, not Haifa. Wasn't that the same scary feeling that came over me, and you too, as we drove through the streets of Haifa? Haifa that I thought I knew rejected me. I have the same feeling in this house, here, in our house. Can you imagine something like that? May our home reject us? Don't you feel that? I believe the same will happen with Khaldun. You will see." Safiya sobbed sadly. Miriam left the room, which now seemed immersed in palpable tension. Said felt as if all the walls that had supported his hope for 20 years were crumbling, allowing him to see things more clearly. He waited for Safiya's sobs to subside. He turned to her and asked, "Do you know what happened to Faris Alubda? Ibn Alubda? Our neighbor?" "Yes. Our neighbor from Ramallah who went to Kuwait. Do you know what happened to him when he visited your home in Jaffa just a week ago? Did he go to Jaffa?" "Yes. A week ago, I believe. He rented a car in Jerusalem and went straight to the Ajami neighborhood. 20 years earlier, he lived in a 2-story house near the Orthodox school in Ajami. Do you remember school? It is behind the Friars College, on the road to Jabalia, about 200 meters on the left. The Orthodox school is on the right, where there is a large courtyard, and, after the courtyard, an intersection, and, in the middle, an alley, because that is where Faris Alubda lived with his family. He was seething with rage that day when he ordered the driver to stop in front of his house. He took the stairs 2 at a time and knocked on the door. 4. It was afternoon. Jaffa looked the same as Faris Alubda had known 20 years before except for the Manchia neighborhood. The few seconds that passed between the moment she knocked on the door and the moment she heard the man's footsteps approaching to open it stretched into an eternity of anger and helpless sadness. Finally, the door opened. The man was tall, dark-skinned, and wore a white shirt with the buttons open. He stretched out his hand to greet the newcomer, without knowing him. Ferris ignored the outstretched hand and spoke with controlled anger. "I came to see my house. This place where you live is my home, and your presence here is a sad comedy that will end one day by the power of a gun. You can, if you want, shoot me right now, but it's my home, and I've waited 20 years to come back. And if..." The man standing on the threshold continued with his hand outstretched. He laughed profusely, approaching Ferris until they were face to face. Then he opened his arms and hugged him. "You don't need to take your anger out on me. I'm Arab too and Yafa'i like you. I know you, you are from the Alubda family. Come in, let's have a coffee." Impressed, Ferris entered and could hardly believe it. It was the same house, the same furniture and arrangement, the same color on the walls, and all the same things he remembered so well. Still smiling, the man led him to the living room. When he opened the door to the room, inviting him in, Ferris was paralyzed and, suddenly, tears welled up in his eyes. The room was exactly as if he had left it that morning, with the same aroma as before, the smell of the sea, which always stirred in his head a rustle of unknown worlds, ready to invade and challenge him. However, it wasn't that impacted him, but the photo of his brother, Badr, which continued to hang on the white wall, the only image in the entire room, with the same thick black ribbon that extended across the right corner of the image. An air of mourning suddenly filled the room and tears began to fall down Ferris' face, still paralyzed. These were old memories, which now exploded as if the portals that kept them trapped were thrown open. His brother, Badr, was the first in Ajami to take up arms in the first week of December 1947. At that time, the house became a meeting place for young people who used to crowd the Orthodox school's sports field every afternoon. Badr joined the fight as if he had been waiting for this day since childhood. Then, on April 6, 1948, Badr was carried home on the shoulders of his companions, with the pistol still at his waist but with the rifle, like his body, crushed by the grenade that hit him on the Tal Arish road. The Ajami neighborhood watched his body in a procession worthy of a martyr. One of his companions went to Iskandar Awad Street, carrying an enlarged photo of Badr, and a calligrapher named Qutb wrote on a small poster that Badr al-Abda had been martyred for the cause of his country's independence. One child carried the sign at the front of the funeral, while two others carried Badr's photo. At night, the photo was returned to the house with a black ribbon tied in the right corner. He still remembered his mother taking down all the other pictures in the room and hanging Badr's picture on the wall facing the door. From then on, the sad smell of mourning permeated the room, where people sat, admired the image and offered their condolences. From where he stood, Ferris could still see the heads of the nails, which had held up other images for 20 years, sticking out of the bare walls. The nails looked like men standing in front of the photo of their martyred brother, Badr al-Abda, hanging alone and draped in black, in the middle of the room. The man said to Ferris, "In between. Sit down. We need to talk. We have been waiting for you for a long time, but we thought we would see you under different circumstances." Ferris entered as if walking through an absurd dream and sat down on a chair facing his brother's photo. It was the first time he had seen him in 20 years. When they left Yafa, they carried nothing with them, not even Badr's photo, which remained there. Ferris couldn't make a single sound. Then the man's two sons entered the room, ran between the chairs and, as soon as they arrived, they left screaming. The man said, "They are Saad and Badr, my sons." "Badr?" "Yes, we named him after his martyred brother." "And the photo?" The man stopped and his expression changed. Then he said, "I'm from Yafa. A resident of Manchia. In the 1948 war, mortar bombs destroyed my house. I don't want to tell you how Yafa fell, or how some people came to help us at a crucial moment. That has passed. The important thing is that, when I returned with the fighters to the abandoned city, they arrested us. I spent a long time in prison. When they released me, I refused to leave Jaffa and rented this house from the government. And the photo? When I entered the house, the photo was the first thing I saw. Maybe he rented the house because of her. It's complicated, I can't really explain it. When they occupied Jaffa, it became an almost deserted city. After I got out of prison, I felt like I was under siege. I didn't see a single Arab here. I was a small island, isolated in a sea of furious hostility. You have not experienced this agony, but I have. When I saw the photo, I found solace in it, a companion who spoke to me, to remind me of things I could be proud of, things I considered the best in our lives. So I decided to rent the house. Then, as now, it seemed to me that, for a man, having a companion who carried weapons and died for his country was something precious and could not be given up. Maybe it was a kind of loyalty to those who fought. I felt that getting rid of the photo would be an unforgivable betrayal. She helped me not only resist, but also remain. That's why the photo stayed here. She remained part of our life. Me, my wife Lamia, my sons Badr and Saad and his brother Badr, we are all a family. We have lived together for 20 years. This was something very important for us. Faris stayed there until midnight, looking at brother Badr smiling in the photo, full of youth and vigor, under that black headband, just like 20 years ago. When Faris got up to leave, he asked if he could take the photo. The man said, "Clear. After all, he is, above all else, your brother." He got up and took the photo off the wall. Behind her was a pale, meaningless rectangle, a disturbing void. Faris took the photo to his car and returned to Ramallah. The whole way there, he looked at her, leaning back in the seat next to her. Badr was smiling, with that young, luminous expression, and Faris continued to look at him as he crossed Jerusalem, to the road that led to Ramallah. Suddenly, a feeling woke him up and made him see that he had no right to keep the photo, although he couldn't understand why. He then asked the driver to return to Jaffa, where he arrived in the morning. He climbed the stairs once again, this time slowly, and knocked on the door. When he received the photo from Faris, the man said, "I felt a terrible emptiness when I looked at the rectangle left on the wall. My wife cried and my children were sad. We're sorry I let you take the photo. After all, this man is one of us. We live with him and he lives with us, he has become part of us. During the night, I told my wife that if you wanted to claim her, you should also claim the house, Jaffa, and us. The photo does not solve your problem, but as far as we are concerned, it is a bridge that connects you to us and us to you." Faris returned to Ramallah alone, said S to his wife. "Faris Alubda, if you knew." And he whispered in an almost inaudible voice, "Now he takes up arms." 5. On the street, an engine made itself heard. Miriam entered the room and her face turned pale. It was almost midnight. The lady slowly went to the window, pulled back the curtain a little and, in a trembling voice, said, "There's Dov. He arrived." From the stairs, youthful but tired footsteps could be heard. Said S followed those footsteps, one after another, up the steps. Ever since he had heard the iron gate slam and the sound of the lock, his nerves had tightened. The minutes lengthened and silence prevailed like an insane and unbearable buzzing. Then he heard the sound of a key opening the door. He looked at Miriam and saw her, for the first time, sitting there, her face pale and trembling. He didn't have enough courage to look at Safiya, so he kept his eyes fixed on the door. He felt, all at once, sweat dripping from every pore on her body. The footsteps coming from the hallway were muffled and seemed confused. Just then he heard a voice, hesitant and strong, call, "Mama." Miriam shivered slightly and rubbed her hands. Said listened to Safiya choking back her tears in silence. The footsteps hesitated a little, as if anticipating something. Again, the same voice spoke and, when it fell silent, Miriam translated in a hesitant whisper. He's asking why I'm in the living room at this time of night. The footsteps continued towards the room. The door was ajar and Miriam said in English. Come here, Dov. There are guests who want to see you. The door opened slowly. At first, it was difficult to believe what I saw, as the light was dim. Then that tall man stepped forward. He was wearing a military uniform and carrying a beret in his hand. Said stood up, as if an electrical shock had thrown him out of his chair. He looked at Miriam and said in a tense voice. Is that the surprise? Is that why you wanted us to wait? Safiya turned to the window and buried her face in her hands, sobbing openly. The young man remained at the entrance, shifting his gaze between the three, confused. Miriam stood up and said slowly, with an artificial calm. I want to introduce you to your parents, your biological parents. The tall young man took a step forward, slowly, and his face changed color. He seemed to have lost his self-confidence in that very moment. He looked at the uniform, then turned to Said, who was still standing in front of him, staring at him intently, and then said in a measured tone. I don't know another mother. As for my father, he was killed at Sinai 11 years ago. I don't know any other parents besides you. Said took 2 steps back, sat down, and placed Safiya's hand in his. He marveled, to himself, at how quickly he managed to regain his calm. If someone had told him 5 minutes ago that he would be sitting there so calmly, he wouldn't have believed it, but now everything had changed. The minutes passed slowly, while everything remained still. Then the tall young man began to wander slowly, 3 steps toward the middle of the room, 3 steps toward the door, then back to the center. He placed the beret on the table, which somehow seemed inappropriate, almost ridiculous, next to the wooden vase with the peacock feathers. Said was overcome by a strange feeling, as if he were watching a play that had been carefully rehearsed. All this reminded him of cheap melodramas and their artificial scenes, which provoke shallow emotions. The young man approached Miriam and said in a decisive voice, so that he was understood explicitly. What did you two do here? Don't tell me they want to take me. With the same tone of voice, Miriam replied. Ask them. He turned around, stiff as a piece of wood, and, as if following an order, asked Said. What do you want, sir? Said maintained his posture, more like, at that moment, a thin shell that hid a burning flame. In a low voice he said. Anything. Nothing, just curiosity. A sudden silence spread, and above it rose the sound of Safiya's sobs, as if coming from the seat of an impressionable spectator. The young man looked away, from Said to Miriam, then to the beret deposited next to the vase. He stepped back as if something forced him to return to the chair next to Miriam. Then he sat down while saying. It's not impossible. It's unbelievable. Calmly, Said asked. Are you in the army? Who do you fight against? Why? The young man stood up suddenly. You have no right to ask me these questions. You are on the other side. Am I on the other side? He laughed heartily. And with that explosive laugh he felt like he was pushing all the pain and tension, fear and anguish out of his chest. He wanted to keep laughing. Laugh until the whole world was turned upside down or until you fell asleep, or died, or ran to the car. But the young man abruptly interrupted him. I don't see any reason to laugh. I see. He laughed some more, stopped, and fell silent as suddenly as when he began. Leaning back in his chair, he felt calm return and searched his pockets for a cigarette. The silence prolonged. Then Safiya composed herself and asked in a low voice. Don't you feel like we're your parents? No one knew to whom the question was addressed. Miriam certainly didn't understand, nor did the tall young man. Said didn't respond. He finished his cigarette and went to the table to put it out. He was forced to move the beret, he did so smiling wryly. Then he sat down again. Then the young man said in a completely changed voice. Let's talk like civilized people. Once again, said laughed and said. You don't want to negotiate, right? You said we're on opposite sides. What happened? Do you really want to negotiate? Agitated, Safiya asked. What did he say? Anything. The young man stood up again and spoke, as if he had rehearsed those phrases a long time ago. I didn't know that Miriam and Efrat weren't my parents until about 3 or 4 years ago. Since I was little, I have been Jewish. I go to synagogue, Jewish school, eat kosher food and study Hebrew. When they told me I wasn't their biological son, it didn't change anything. Even when I was told later that my parents were Arabs, nothing changed. No, nothing has changed. One thing is certain, ultimately, man is a cause. Who said that? What did you say? Who said man is a cause? I don't know. I do not remember. Why do you ask? Curiosity. In fact, that's exactly what's going through my head right now. Is man a cause? Yes. So why did you come looking for me? I don't know. Maybe because I didn't know it yet or to be more sure of it. I don't know. Anyway, why don't you continue? The tall young man walked again with his hands clasped behind his back, 3 steps towards the door, 3 steps towards the table. It seemed like he had memorized a long lesson and when he was interrupted, he didn't know how to finish it. He reviewed the first part silently in his head so he could continue. Suddenly he said. After learning that you were Arabs, I was wondering, how could a father and mother abandon their 5-month-old child and run away? And how can those who are not his blood parents raise and educate him for 20 years? 20 years. Do you want to say anything, sir? No, said replied briefly and decisively, gesturing with his hand for him to continue. I'm in reserve. I have never participated in direct combat, so I could express my feelings, but perhaps in the future I can confirm what I am about to say now. I belong here and this lady is my mother. I don't know you two and I don't feel anything special about you. There is no need for you to describe your feelings to me. Perhaps your first fight will be against a Fide named Khalid. Khalid is my son. I hope you noticed that I didn't refer to him as your brother, since, as you said, the man is a cause. Last week, Khalid joined the Fidaean. Do you know why we call him Khalid and not Khaldun? Because we always thought we would find you, even if it took 20 years. But that didn't happen. We didn't find it. And I don't believe we'll find it. Said got up with difficulty. Only now did he feel tired, as if he was consuming his life in vain. These feelings gave way to an unexpected sadness that almost brought him to tears. He knew it was a lie, that Khalid had not joined the Fidaean. In fact, he himself was the one who banned it. Even he threatened to renounce Khalid if he defied him and joined the resistance. The few days that had passed since then felt like a nightmare that ended with a terrifying image. Was it he himself who, a few days ago, had threatened to renounce his son Khalid? What a strange world. And now he could find no way to defend himself in the face of this tall young man's renunciation of his membership, other than to be proud of Khalid's fatherhood, the same Khalid he had prevented from joining the Fidaean, by means of that irrelevant lash he used to call a fatherhood. Who knows, perhaps Khalid took advantage of the fact that they were in Haifa to escape. Ah, if he did. What a disappointment it would be, in relation to all the values of this existence, to return and find Khalid at home waiting for him. He took a few steps forward and again counted the 5 peacock feathers in the wooden vase. For the first time since the tall young man entered the room, he looked at Miriam and said slowly. He wonders how a father and a mother can leave their baby in the crib and run away. Madam, you didn't tell him the truth, and when she did, it was too late. Were we the ones who left him? Were we the ones who killed that child, near the church of Bethlehem, in Hadar? The child, whose body, you said yourself, was the first thing that shocked you in this world that daily and vilely tramples on justice. Perhaps that child was Khaldun. Perhaps the little thing that died that miserable day was Khaldun. In fact, it was Khaldun. You lied to us. It was Khaldun. He died. This young man is none other than an orphan you found in Poland or England. The young man shrank in his chair in defeat, and said to himself, we have lost him, but surely, after all this, he has also lost himself and will never be the same as he was an hour ago. He felt an enormous and inexplicable satisfaction, which impelled him to the chair where the young man was sitting. He stopped before him and said, man, in the last analysis, is a cause. That's what you said and it's true. But what cause? That is the question. Think carefully. Khalid is also a cause, not because he is my son. Anyway, let's leave the details aside. When we are in front of a man, none of this has to do with flesh, blood, identity cards, or passports. Can you understand this? Good. Let's imagine that you welcomed us as we dreamed of for 20 years with hugs, kisses, and tears. Would this change anything? Even if you had accepted us, would we accept you? May your name be Khaldun, or Dav, or Ishmael, or any other. What changes? Despite everything, I don't feel contempt for you. It's not just your fault. Perhaps guilt will become your destiny from this moment on. But before that, what else? Is not man what is injected into him, hour after hour, day after day, year after year? If I regret anything, it's having believed, for 20 years, the opposite of that. He returned to his seat, dragging his steps, trying to appear as calm as possible. In the few steps he took, past the shell-studded table where peacock feathers swayed in the wooden vase, he felt that everything looked completely different from when he first entered that room a few hours earlier. Then he asked himself, what is the homeland? He smiled bitterly and collapsed into the chair, as if it were a falling object. Safiya, worried, looked at him with wide eyes and a questioning expression. Only now did it occur to Said that he could involve her in conversation. Then he asked him, what is the homeland? She stepped back, surprised, with the same look of astonishment, as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. So, she asked with a somewhat suspicious delicacy. What did you say? I asked, what is the homeland? I asked myself that just now. Well, what is the homeland? Are these two chairs that have stood in this room for 20 years? This table? Those peacock feathers? That picture of Jerusalem on the wall? The copper lock? The oak? The balcony? What is the homeland? Khaldun. Our illusions about him? Fatherhood? The affiliation? What is the homeland? For Farisalubda, what is the homeland? Is that your brother's photo hanging on the wall? They're just questions. Once again, Safiya suddenly began to cry, drying her tears with a small white handkerchief. Said looked at her and thought, how old this woman has become. She wasted her youth waiting for this moment, not knowing it would be a terrible moment. He looked at Dav again. It seemed absolutely impossible to him that he could have been born to his wife, and he tried to discover some resemblance between Dav and Khalid, but he could not find any. Instead, he glimpsed an opposition between the two, which surprised him and made him lose any feeling for that young man. It seemed to him that all his memories of Khaldun were a handful of snow that the burning sun soon melted. She continued to look at him when Dav stood up and stood stiffly in front of Said, as if leading a line of hidden soldiers. He tried hard to calm down. Perhaps none of this would happen if you behaved as civilized and conscientious people should behave. You shouldn't have left Haifa. If this were not possible, they should not, under any circumstances, have left a baby in their crib, and if, even so, that were also impossible, they should never have stopped trying to return. If that were also impossible? 20 years have passed, sir. 20 years. What did you do during that time to claim your son? If I were you, I would have taken up arms for this cause. Is there any more relevant reason? You are weak, weak. Chained by the shackles of delay and paralysis. Don't tell me you spent 20 years crying. Tears will not bring back what was lost, and they will not perform miracles. All the tears in the world can't wash away a small boat carrying a couple searching for their lost son. So you spent 20 years crying. Is that what you're telling me? Is that your weapon, insignificant, worn out? Said recoiled, shocked, brutally struck, and overcome by vertigo. Was it true? Or just a prolonged dream, a sticky nightmare that covered him like a huge octopus? He looked at Safiya, whose astonishment took the form of defeat, and felt a deep sadness. Just to not look foolish, he walked up to her and said in a trembling voice, "I don't want to argue with him." What did he say? Nothing. Well, he said we are cowards. Safiya asked innocently. And because we are cowards he can behave like this? With that, she faced the young man who was still standing. The peacock feathers behind him seemed to form the tail of a large khaki-colored rooster. This sight, surprisingly, excited said, "Who said? My wife asks if the fact that we are cowards gives you the right to be like that." As you can see, she innocently recognizes that we were cowards. From that perspective, you are correct. But that doesn't justify anything, because two wrongs don't make a right. If that were the case, then what happened to Efrat and Miriam in Auschwitz would be correct. When will you stop believing that the weaknesses and mistakes of others are your own prerogatives? These old topics are worn out and these mathematical methods are full of trickery. First you say that our mistakes justify your mistakes, then you say that one injustice does not justify another. You use the first logic to justify your existence here, and the second to avoid punishment they deserve. It seems to me that you really like this strange game. Once again, you are trying to make our weakness a racehorse to ride and tame us. No, I am not addressing you as if you were an Arab. But now I know, better than anyone, that man is a cause, and not flesh and blood passed down from generation to generation, like a merchant who negotiates a can of meat with his customer. I speak to you assuming, ultimately, that you are a human being. Jew or whatever, you have to understand things as they are. I know that one day you will realize these things and you will know that the greatest crime a man can commit is to believe, even for a moment, that the weakness and mistakes of others give you the right to exist at your own expense and justify your own mistakes and crimes. He was silent for a moment and looked directly into Dov's eyes. And you? Do you believe we will continue to make mistakes? If one day we stop making mistakes, what will be left for you? She felt that they should get up and leave, for everything had come to an end and there was nothing left to say. In that moment, she felt a deep longing for Khalid and wished she could fly to him, hug him, kiss him, and cry on his shoulder, reversing the roles of father and son in a unique and inexplicable way. This is the homeland, he said, smiling, to himself. Afterwards, he addressed his wife. Do you know what homeland is, Safiya? The homeland is none of this happening. And she asked, a little tensely. What do you have, said. Anything. Anything. I was just thinking out loud. I'm looking for the real Palestine, a Palestine that is more than memory, more than peacock feathers, more than a sun, more than pencil scribbles on the stairs. I asked myself, what is Palestine to Khalid? He doesn't know the vase, nor the photo, nor the staircase, nor Halisa, nor Khaldun. However, for him, Palestine is something worth taking up arms and dying for. And for us, for you and me, it's just a search for something buried beneath the dust of memory. And look what we found under that dust. More powder. We were mistaken when we thought that the homeland was just the past. For Khalid, the homeland is the future. That's where we differ, and that's why Khalid wants to take up arms. Tens of thousands like Khalid will not be stopped by the harmless tears of men who search the depths of their defeats for fragments of shields and broken flowers. They are looking to the future so that they can correct our mistakes and the mistakes of the entire world. Dov is our shame, but Khalid is our lasting honor. Didn't I tell you from the beginning that we shouldn't come, as that would require war? Let's go. Khalid knew before we did. Ah, Safiya. Ah. He stood up and Safiya stood next to him, rubbing her handkerchief, confused, while Dov remained sitting and curled up. His beret thrown over the vase looked, once again and for some reason, ridiculous. Miriam said slowly. You can't go out like this. We don't talk enough about the issue. Said replied. There is nothing more to say. For you maybe it was all just bad luck. But history doesn't work like that. When we arrived here, we were going against history as when, I admit, we left Haifa. However, it was only supposed to be temporary. You know something, ma'am? I think every Palestinian will pay a price. I know many who paid with their children. Now I know that I also paid with a child, in a strange way, but I paid the price. This was my first installment, and it is something that will be difficult to explain. She turned and saw Dov, still curled up in the chair, holding his head in his hands. When Said arrived at the door, he said, You two can stay at our house temporarily. It will take a war to put an end to this. Then he went downstairs looking at all the things carefully. Everything seemed less important than it had been a few hours before, unable to awaken any deep feeling in him. He heard the sound of Safiya's footsteps close behind, now more confident than before. Outside, the street was almost empty. She got into the car and let it go down in silence to the bottom of the slope. Only at the bend did she start the engine and head towards Malik Faisal Street. Made silence. He did not utter a single word until he reached the entrance to Ramallah. He only then looked at his wife and said, I hope Khalid left during our absence.